a co-production of The Appeal and Now This. I'm your host, Jay Willis. Today, we are talking about wage theft, the illegal practice of employers not paying people what they're owed for their labor. Economists estimate that employers steal more than $50 billion from their employees annually. And the problem is especially acute for minimum wage workers who see their employers steal $15 billion, or about $3,300 per employee every year. Wage theft, almost by definition, disproportionately hurts lower income people, and studies have found that victims are also more likely to be women and Black and brown workers. Little crash course in federal labor law, or what remains of it. While the Fair Labor Standards Act has been around since 1938, it is full of loopholes, as any tipped worker can probably attest, and the agency in charge of enforcing it is dramatically understaffed. So the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division is responsible for protecting over 143 million workers in almost 10 million workplaces. But as of 2013, it only had about 1,100 investigators. If you do a little math, that's about one investigator for every 130,000 people. So in light of the federal government's failure to do anything meaningful here, really, cities, states, and territories are taking on the tasks of prevention and enforcement themselves. Los Angeles has an Office of Wage Theft. Chicago, Miami, and Washington, D.C. all have created programs to deal with it. Philadelphia DA Larry Krasner created a unit to go after wage thieves, and El Paso and Minneapolis were some of the first cities to actually indict employers for wage theft back in 2013. So here to go into this a little bit more with us today are Professor Nicole Hallett of the University of Chicago Law School and Columbus, Ohio City Council member Rob Dorans, whose work recently led to the creation of a wage enforcement commission in that city. Professor, council member, thanks so much for being us. And Councilman, I'll begin with you. Tell me a little bit about how this new wage enforcement commission works. What does this thing actually do?
Thanks, Jay, and I'm really excited to be here today, especially to talk about this topic. I think you laid the baseline here pretty well at the start of what something like wage theft can do to workers. And I think it's very easy to get lost in when we talk about billions of dollars out of folks' pockets. Those are individuals, those are working families that don't have the money, especially in times like these that are so tough for folks to make ends meet, to put food on the table, to put gas in the car, to send their kids to college. So I think when you talk about the federal government advocating its responsibility to ensure that people are paid properly, it's up to cities and states to do what we can to fight back on this. And the commission that we're setting up here in Columbus, Ohio, that pursuant to an ordinance that we just passed several weeks ago, is going to focus on a couple of different things. One, we're going to ban folks that have violated any state or federal wage and hour law from direct city contracts for 3 years. The commission itself is going to be responsible for publishing that list. And not only that, we're going to make sure that any subcontractor that works on a city contract also has not violated those laws. So it's not only important to attack the actual business themselves, but ensuring that the chain of contract. Because when you think about a lot of how these different developments work, is it's not only the business at the top, but they're hiring a subcontractor for subcontractor for subcontractor. And that's where you really see some of this abuse happen, where it's cash under the table with misclassification or other things in which these basic protections for workers aren't even thought of. So that's one. We've also put into place what I like to call sort of presumptive independent contractor ban, meaning if you're going to go to work on a city contract or on a project covered by a city incentive, and you want to use someone who is an independent contractor, you have to justify that use prior to that individual working under that contract. And there's a really important reason for that, is that traditionally, very, very few workers actually comply or meet the standards set out by the IRS and the right to control test. And this is typically the standard that's used by the federal government and states to determine who should be an independent contractor. And the reason that it's important to talk about independent contractors is that this is how businesses get out of paying, unemployment compensation, Bureau of Workers' Compensation, all these, the employer portion, the payroll tax, all these fixed costs of doing business that are providing protection for workers, but also to ensure the social safety net exists. I've heard from workers that went to file for unemployment during this pandemic only to find out that their employer called them a 1099 wrongfully, and that they were then therefore ineligible for unemployment compensation. So we feel it's very important for us to take not only the step when we talk about wage theft, but also to look at these independent contractor misclassification issues on as many things as we possibly can. And I'm really interested to hear from Professor Hallett here in a minute about her study on this. But I think one of the things that we want to focus on is what can we do as a city? Last year we had a $980 million capital budget. We had a nearly $1 billion operating budget. That's a lot of money that we put in our local economy that should be put in the economy with businesses who are doing things the right way. So we feel starting there and then moving also on to city incentivized project, which represents billions of dollars in investment in our community. Columbus is the 14th largest city in the country. It's continuing to grow. We're going to be over 1 million citizens by the end of the decade, or I think in a couple of years from now. So when we talk about this private development that's been incentivized, we're not only talking about just the several $1 billion worth of contracts that are covered by this wage theft ordinance, but also then tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that are on these subsidized projects as well. So I'm really excited for this commission to get to work and its ability to start policing these contracts.
Wow, teasing the appearance of the next guest, really sort of stepping on my job there, council member. Appreciate it. I know you've represented workers in disputes with employers to return hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid wages as part of your legal career. Tell me a little bit about how wage theft and wage theft prevention intersect with organized labor, with the organized labor movement.
Well, thank you, Jay. So, oh, I'm sorry. Was that a question for Rob or was that a question for me?
It was one for Rob, but I realize in retrospect that by invoking you, I might have created that confusion.
Okay.
So I'll ask him first, but then I'd love to hear the same from you.
Great.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, so I'm a proud third generation union member. I've spent my legal career working as a union lawyer, and it's been very exciting to me to be able to do that work. I get to go to work every day for guys like my dad who are IBW members. My grandfather was a plumber and pipe fitter. And one of the things you've seen is that, one of the best defenses to wage theft is a collective bargaining agreement. When you talk about unions, they have the ability to ensure that folks are paid, well represented. So wage theft typically doesn't occur in a union environment. That said, unions care about the ability for everyone in society to earn a fair wage. So, both here at the local level on the legislation that I sponsored and we passed, and I think nationally understands that a rising tide lifts all boats. And that's why when we look at wage theft, it's not really affecting union members, but it's affecting the marketplace in general. And frankly, when you think about how this affects union employers that are required to do things the right way by paying a fair wage, by paying, providing good health care, providing retirement benefits, all these kinds of things we want to see from reputable employers that generally union employers provide, they're diluting the marketplace and making it more expensive for our folks to compete. Which is why I think, organized labor, both here in Columbus, Ohio and nationally, have said that, even though this doesn't affect our membership, we want to see wage theft ordinances, wage theft efforts pushed at the local, state, and federal level to make sure that, all Americans have the opportunity to earn a fair wage and are protected.
Thanks. Professor, I'll ask you the same question.
Sure. Well, part of my confusion is that I started my career before I went into academia as a workers' rights attorney and represented low-wage workers. It sounds like in much the same way. So, I would agree with everything that the councilman said. I think historically some unions were a bit skeptical of these sort of broad worker movements that protect non-unionized and unionized workers. But I do think now most unions recognize that if the wage and hour laws are not enforced, there is no floor. There is no floor, and therefore unions cannot bargain above a floor if there is no floor. So it's really win-win for the unions. I think most unions want to support all workers, and also it's better for their own members. If they're competing, let's say in the, we'll take the example of city contracts, which is what the Columbus ordinance deals with. If you are competing, if you're a unionized company and you are competing with non-unionized companies for city contracts, and the non-unionized company is using independent contractors, is committing wage theft, and therefore undercutting your bids, your unionized company is not going to be doing so well, and therefore the unionized workforce isn't going to be doing so well. So this is really a win-win for unions, and it's also, I would just add, a win-win for most companies, because it's a substantial minority of companies that are committing wage theft. It's not every company. It's not a few bad apples either. It's a substantial minority. But what it does is it undercuts the market for those companies that are actually complying with the law. There are many businesses out there that want to treat their workers well, pay them what they've earned and what they're entitled to under the law. But if you have a situation in which there's vast under enforcement of wage and hour laws, those companies that are using this as a business practice are going to benefit. And so it really benefits companies as well.
Councilmember, you mentioned the growth of Columbus right now. Of the fastest growing cities in the country, Columbus is the only one in the Midwest, and it is the second biggest city in the Midwest after Chicago. It's bigger than San Francisco. Which is something that not a lot of people know. And by not a lot of people, I mean me before I read that. Is there anything about Columbus that you think, the environment there right now, that makes workers there a little more vulnerable to the dangers of wage theft?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Jay. You know, whenever you see growth and rapid growth in a community, there is lots of potential for this kind of activity to go on. And I'll just talk about the construction market and sort of services sector for a moment. So Columbus is the 14th largest city in the country, as we talked about. We've moved up, I think, 3 places in the past 5 years as far as how quickly we're growing. The region itself is poised for, the metropolitan statistical area is poised for huge growth as well. Whenever you see that happening, you've got tens of thousands of people coming to a place that doesn't have, the housing ready for them, doesn't have the commercial infrastructure ready for them. When you see this growth happen so fast, so what does that mean? That means you build really quickly. It means you create a lot of things very quickly, which means that the marketplace has some very good actors in it, but also has some very bad actors who are looking to make a quick buck. And the second that they can lower their transactional cost of doing business by cheating their workers out of money, they're going to do it. And that is certainly exacerbated in a place in which you have a lot of growth and a lot of development. Growth and development isn't necessarily all a bad thing, but it certainly does attract folks that are going to try and make as many bucks as they can off working folks as possible. And that's why you have to have these kind of protections in place to make sure that you can scrutinize it. When you talk about, you're talking about the amount of wage inspectors at the federal level, we have 4 wage and hour inspectors for the entire state of Ohio. 4, not just for Columbus, for over 12 million people in the state of Ohio. I have 890,000 people in the city of Columbus. So I'm not even going to try and do the math. There's a reason I went to law school, because I can't do math. But when you think about what that means for actual enforcement, you're leaving a lot on the table. When you see that rapid growth happens, you can't keep up with it. And again, getting back to the point you made earlier, and Professor Hallett was talking about why organized labor is engaged in this. Unfortunately, a lot of these wage and hour investigations now are left to members of organized labor to initiate, because again, they understand what happens in the marketplace if they don't do it. So when you see this kind of growth, when you see this kind of rapid growth, it's good for a community, but also there's some downsides, and the downsides sometimes tend to be folks trying to take advantage of workers.
Professor Hallett, you've written some about the causes and consequences of wage theft, and more specifically, you've argued that a lot of the most common proposed policy reforms interventions really fail to address the problem. What's the disconnect there? Why is what's being done not getting the job done?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So, in general, well, first of all, it's great that local cities and counties have been addressing this problem. As Jay queued up at the beginning, there's an under enforcement nationally. There's an under enforcement in most states. Councilman says that there are 4 investigators for Ohio. There are some states that have no investigators or 1 investigator for the whole state. And so it's really important that local jurisdictions are taking the lead on this issue. Now, in terms of the kinds of policies they put into place, there are several different types. And I basically think that some are going to be more effective than others. So the easy policy to put into place, and which costs doesn't cost state money, government money, is to basically put additional penalties on employers. So say, okay, instead of double damages, if you commit wage theft, it's treble damages. Or if you raise the minimum wage, because that means that there's more money in people's pockets. And those are really good, important reforms. The problem is that if no one is complying with the law, it really doesn't matter what the minimum wage is or what the penalties are, because no one is paying the penalties, no one is paying the minimum wage. And so I think the local ordinances that have been the most effective have actually set up enforcement mechanisms at the local level. They've set up offices to handle wage complaints, or they've set up commissions like in Columbus. And the job of these agencies is really to do the enforcement at the state and federal level that's not happening. At the end of the day, if employers think that they can get away with it, they will probably do it. This is not rocket science. If someone thinks they can do it and they get away with it, they will. And so if we have more enforcement, if employers think there's at least a chance that something bad will happen to their company, whether they lose a city contract, whether they have to pay a judgment, that is going to deter employers from violating the law, and it's going to be more money in the pockets of workers. So, I applaud Columbus on actually coming up with a statutory scheme that will allow real enforcement to happen. That has happened other places, and I think that's the direction that local jurisdictions should be going when addressing this problem.
Thanks, Professor. I know you've also written about how economic calculations aren't enough in this debate, that fighting wage theft also requires changing social norms. What do you mean by that? What needs to get shifted in order for there to be sort of meaningful progress in the fight against wage theft?
Sure. So basically the idea is that, we all walk around in the world all day. There's lots of laws that we're subject to. And for the most part, most people are law abiding, even when they don't think there's like an imminent risk that they're going to get caught, right? So, I use the example of taxes. So you think about, am I going to get audited by the IRS if I fail to pay my taxes? Probably not, because they don't audit anyone anymore, right? So it's like very unlikely I'm going to get caught. But there's sort of a social norm, at least for individuals, at least middle-class individuals, that they should pay their taxes. And so I do it because that's what's socially expected of me. If you think about the tax system again, and you think about corporate taxes, you think about wealthy individuals paying their taxes, it's a very different social norm. It's basically pay as little as possible. And if you get caught and have to pay some fines, it's the cost of doing business. And, that's sort of how it works. Now, part of that is because we don't enforce the tax code, but part of it is just a difference in the social norms such that corporations do not feel socially confined to pay their taxes in the same way that you and I do. So when you translate that to wage theft, what that essentially means is that as long as employers feel like it's not a big deal, that it's just the cost of doing business, they're much less likely to comply with the law. But if social norms change such that it's seen as immoral to not pay your workers what they're owed, then social norms will do some of what enforcement would also do. Okay, so what that means is if an employer is at a cocktail party, right, and kind of mentions that they're skimping on overtime, what's the response to that going to be? Is it going to be like, oh, good, you found a way to cut costs? Or is it going to be, wow, that's really problematic? Are customers going to stop going to your store if it comes out in the press that you aren't paying your workers appropriately? So the thing about local wage theft legislation is it actually can have both. It can help both. So It can help with enforcement. So there's a greater risk that the employers are going to get caught. That increases compliance. But it also sends a signal that the government cares, that it's important. It sends a signal that we should all be taking wage theft really seriously. And it isn't immediate, but what can happen over time is that social norms change, and then employers police themselves, and less enforcement is necessary in order to make sure workers get paid what they're owed.
Thanks. I'll want to return to you for a moment, Councilman. How have you seen the pandemic, the COVID-19 health and economic crisis impact wage theft in your city, in your districts?
Well, first, if you don't mind, I'd love to build on what Professor Hallett was mentioning there for just a second. I think that is incredibly important for local governments and states to show this kind of leadership, because literally on July 1st, this Department of Labor under the Trump administration announced that they will no longer pursue additional damages for Fair Labor Standards Act violations. So to the professor's point, you get caught, you just pay what you owe to begin with. So what kind of disincentive is that, right? We just had an announcement a week or two ago that the Department of Labor is also going to pursue administrative rulemaking to basically, in my opinion, almost destroy the right to control test that covers who classifies an independent contractor and who doesn't. Again, making it easier to withhold these taxes, pay unemployment compensation, do all these fixed costs of doing businesses. So when you have this leadership at the federal level that is encouraging businesses over and over and over again, the way for you to get ahead is to cheat. The way for you to get ahead is use these rules that we've constructed to screw working people. That is incredibly wrong. And that's the message that has come out for nearly 4 years from this administration, which is why it's so incredibly valuable that you have other governments that are saying, no, in our community, our values are different. If you end up on a banned list in Columbus, we're going to publish that. We're going to say, we're not only going to not do business with you, but other people in the community are going to know that you intentionally took money out of they might as well be robbing people on the street. And we have this different mindset in this country that when people commit white collar crime, they're somehow different because they're professionals, that we punish those crimes very differently than folks that do other things. And frankly, I'm offended by that. And I think other people should be too. So when Professor Hallett talks about these social norms that we should have about businesses doing the right thing, I think when you look at the failure that has happened over the past 3+ years in the federal level, it's incredibly important that folks take steps to change those norms, change those cultures on a local level. And Jay, to your point about how this has happened in the pandemic, low-wage workers have always been the most vulnerable. The pandemic has made them more vulnerable, especially when you're talking about, again, I know I keep harping on it, but folks who have been misclassified as independent contractors, these folks went to go file for unemployment and found out, I'm not eligible. The only thing I can rely upon is maybe the pandemic assistance from the federal level that they've now run out. That now in Ohio, you can only get $300 a week. So many of these folks were vulnerable before the pandemic, and they're even more vulnerable now. And when you have businesses coming to them and say, hey, we've got this minimum wage job, but we're going to make you show up half an hour or an hour early before you're allowed to clock in. There's folks that are willing to take that job because there may not be something else out there for them. So the pandemic, the pandemic Great Depression that a lot of low income workers have dealt with, when we talk about, for most, well-off folks, the pandemic hasn't really affected people all that much. Now, hopefully people's health is okay, but when you really drill into the numbers, this economic slowdown has been borne by people of color and women at the lower end of the economic spectrum. And that's who, Jay, you talked about on the outset of this, that's who's more likely to be affected by wage theft to begin with. So whether it's Columbus, Ohio, or Chicago, or Seattle, this is affecting people at that end even more so because they were feeling it before this even happened.
Question I'd like to close with, and I'll ask you first, Professor. Suppose every city were to establish a wage theft commission of the type that we're talking about here. Would that be enough, or would we need to take additional steps to defeat this problem?
Well, it's a problem it's a very hard to solve problem. So I think we're going to have to address it in a lot of different ways. And I also just want to point out that even if every major city in the country did this, there are many, many Americans who do not live in cities. And I think often what happens in these policy debates is that people in rural areas get left behind. There are people being victims of wage theft everywhere, on farms, in rural communities, in urban areas. And so while it's great that cities have been taking the lead, we really need, all local jurisdictions, so counties, and we need states to step up too. It's frankly unacceptable that Ohio only has 4 investigators. That's a dereliction of duty. They need to be actually funding this, because there are a lot of people who don't live in Columbus and Cincinnati and Cleveland, wherever. So this is a problem that is it's not going to be solved by a single policy intervention. But at the end of the day, this is a very, very important step. These commissions and these local offices can make a difference in terms of whether workers are getting paid. The Seattle office, for instance, has recovered millions of dollars for workers since it was created 4 years ago. That's millions of dollars that are in the pockets of low-income individuals, and otherwise they would be out of luck. More gets stolen from wage theft than all other kinds of robberies put together. So bank robberies, muggings, all of the different kinds of robberies that you normally think about. If you add up all of that, low wage workers lose more money every year. And so this has to be a problem that it's not just like a one and done. You don't create something and then move off. It's something we have to continue to reevaluate and figure out new and innovative ways to address the problem.
Thanks, Council Member. I'll give you the last word on this. What else do policymakers need to do here?
Well, I think to the professor's point, I think we need to focus on what are the policy solutions that lead to meaningful outcomes for working people. I think it's very easy for us to say, hey, we're going to increase the penalties, pat ourselves on the back, have a press conference, and move on. That may make us feel good and get a headline for the day as policymakers and politicians, but that doesn't fix the problem. And certainly we can't solve all of this on the local level. Unfortunately, as I've talked about, there's a lot of lacking at the federal level, which trickles all the way down to here at the local. But I think we need to focus in on the policy solutions that are effective. And I think in the long term is a lot about what Professor Hallett's talking about. It's changing these social norms that we have about how we create an economy that works for everybody. And we've unfortunately seen this too often in the federal tax code, where we invite the worst possible outcomes. And we've seen that, on the local level and state level as well. So, I am encouraged that there are so many cities that are taking this on. But again, one person being defrauded by their employer is too many. And whether it's at the state or federal level, I think it's time for there to be a critical mass of folks saying enough is enough on this. And we're going to create policy solutions wherever people are, whether that's city government, county government, or state or federal, to find a solution. Because again, at the end of the day, if folks are working, they're owed what they're owed. They're going to work a fair day's wage. They're owed a fair day's wage, and that's incredibly important in this country that has historically valued hard work. Right? That's who we typically like to think of ourselves as Americans, as people who put in hard labor and do the job right the first time. And I think for policymakers, no matter where they are, they need to take a hard look at themselves and think about what they're doing to make sure that workers in their community are being respected and provided with the dignity that they deserve.
Councilmember Dorans, Professor Hallett, I know we're getting to the top of the hour, so that seems like a good place to leave it. I want to thank both of you for joining us on the briefing today. And to viewers at home, thank you for joining us on the briefing today. This episode will be available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you listen to them. We'll be live again tomorrow at noon Eastern to talk with Oregon Senator Jeff Merkley about ending forced prison labor. In the meantime, please follow Appeal News on Facebook and The Appeal on Twitter for more updates and shows like this one. Again, this has been The Briefing. I'm Jay Willis.